There is something wrong with the math of extinction. Not the extinction of species, we understand that well enough, but the extinction of a people, a culture, a civilization that by all physical evidence should have been extraordinarily difficult to erase. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed. The maps say it did. You can look them up right now. The 1570 Abraham Ortelius Atlas, the 1626 John Speed map, the 1706 Guillaume de Lisle chart. All of them place Tartaria, sometimes called Tartary, across an enormous swath of Central and Northern Asia. It was not a myth, it was cartography. Real, published, institutionally endorsed cartography. And yet somewhere between the 17th and 19th century, this entity, whatever it was, disappears from the record. Not gradually, not through a series of documented military campaigns that we can trace step by step. It simply recedes. The question that sits with me isn't what Tartaria was, it's what was done to it. Now, before we go further, I want to be clear about something. The mainstream explanation for the decline of Tartar civilization is perfectly coherent and well documented. The Mongol successor states fragmented. Russian imperial expansion pressed steadily east and south. Nomadic confederacies lost political cohesion. It's a reasonable account, and most historians accept it without hesitation, and I accept parts of it too. Fragmentation happened. Russian expansion happened, but here is what that explanation does not easily account for. The physical scale of what was apparently built across that territory, and the extraordinary speed with which the memory of it seems to have been compressed into near nothing. Walk through the old buildings of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, the ruins scattered across the Kazakh steppe, and you find architecture scaled in ways that require a second look. Doorways taller than function demands, ceilings that serve no obvious practical purpose, proportions that feel calibrated for bodies significantly larger than the ones that now occupy those spaces. I know how that sounds. I know the rational explanations. Prestige architecture, symbolic scale, the desire of rulers to appear grand. These are legitimate interpretations, and I have given them considerable weight, but they don't fully resolve the consistency. The same proportions appear across thousands of kilometers, across centuries of construction. The official record does contain references to unusual stature among the populations of the eastern steppes. Giovanni da Pian del Carpin, the Franciscan friar who travelled to the Mongol court in 1245, described the people he encountered in terms that historians have generally read as exaggeration or cultural othering. But the descriptions are strangely specific. He wasn't alone. Marco Polo's accounts, whatever we think of their reliability, include descriptions of people in the eastern regions whose physical characteristics deviated from European norms in consistent ways. Again, historians call it exaggeration, but when the same exaggerations appear in independent travellers writing centuries apart, the pattern deserves a longer pause. Here is where I want to introduce what I think of as the first crack in the conventional picture. Not a dramatic revelation, a small one. The depopulation of Central Asia between roughly 1340 and 1450 is, by any measure, catastrophic. Historians acknowledge this. What they discuss less readily is how complete it was and how fast. The Black Death reached Central Asia before it reached Europe. The evidence for this is in the burial records excavated near Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan, grave inscriptions from 1338 and 1339 that mention pestilence, predating the European outbreak by nearly a decade. a plague originating in the heart of Tartaria's territory, moving outward. The mainstream reading of this is that the plague was an unfortunate natural disaster, a zoonotic spillover from rodent populations that happened to strike Central Asia first before moving along trade routes. That reading is scientifically defensible. I am not disputing the mechanism. I am asking about the scale, and whether the scale was entirely accidental, because here is what the records show when you compile them carefully. The population collapse in the Mongol successor states during the 14th and 15th centuries was not a contraction, it was a near erasure. Entire cities emptied, infrastructure abandoned. The great postal relay network, the YAM system, which had connected this civilization across thousands of kilometers, simply stopped functioning. A postal relay network. Think about that for a moment. The YAM system required thousands of stations, tens of thousands of horses, and an administrative structure sophisticated enough to coordinate it all across a territory larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. That doesn't collapse because of political fragmentation alone. Something else happened to the people who ran it. Now let me steelman the conventional explanation before I go further, because intellectual honesty demands it. Climate change is well documented in this period. The early 14th century saw the beginning of the Little Ice Age, which disrupted agricultural patterns across Eurasia. Famine preceded plague in many regions. Population loss from natural causes was severe and real. I accept that fully, but here is the detail that the climate and plague model does not cleanly explain: the genetic signature of what comes after. Modern genomic studies of Central Asian populations show something unusual, a pattern of genetic bottlenecking, followed by rapid population replacement in the 14th and 15th centuries that goes beyond what disease mortality alone would predict. Genetic bottlenecking means that a population was reduced to such a small surviving group that the diversity of its gene pool collapsed. What follows is replacement, not by descendants of the original population recovering, but by different genetic lineages moving into the vacuum. The territory didn't repopulate from within, it was repopulated from outside. This is documented science, not speculation. The studies exist, work done by population geneticists at institutions including the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, examining ancient DNA samples from across Central Asia. The replacement is real. The question the studies don't address, because it's outside their methodological scope, is whether the collapse was facilitated. Facilitated, that's the word I keep returning to. Not engineered, not designed, not orchestrated. Facilitated. There's a difference, and the difference matters. Engineered implies a specific architect with a specific plan. Facilitated implies something more diffuse, a set of conditions created, maintained, or allowed to continue by parties who understood what those conditions would produce. Here is what we know about the political context. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol Khanates, the political successors to the empire that had administered Tartaria, were in active competition with the expanding states of the west and south. The Golden Horde was under pressure from Russian principalities in the north and Byzantine remnants in the west. The Chagatai Khanate, which controlled much of Central Asia proper, was simultaneously dealing with internal fragmentation and external pressure from Timur, Tamerlane, who by the late 14th century was carving through the region with a campaign of destruction that historians describe, without hyperbole, as among the most thorough in recorded history. Timur's campaigns are worth pausing on because they are one of the few mechanisms in the official record that could account for the scale of depopulation we're discussing. His forces, according to contemporary chroniclers, killed millions. They destroyed irrigation systems that had supported agriculture for centuries. They dismantled the administrative memory of entire regions. And yet, and this is the part that sits uncomfortably, even Timur's campaigns cannot account for the genetic replacement pattern. His forces killed people, they didn't introduce a new genetic population. The incoming lineages that appear in the post-15th century record are not Timurid, they're something else, moving in from directions the military history doesn't explain. So we have a plague originating in Tartaria's heartland, moving outward at a moment of political vulnerability, a population collapse far exceeding mortality models for the documented causes, a genetic replacement by incoming populations, and infrastructure, vast, sophisticated infrastructure, abandoned so completely that within 2 centuries, its builders had become a subject of folklore rather than history. Now I want to address the counter-argument I find most intellectually serious, because it deserves that respect. The counter-argument is simple. Civilizations collapse. The Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome, the Maya decline. History is full of sophisticated civilizations that vanished faster than we would expect, for reasons we still argue about. That's true, and I hold it seriously. But the Bronze Age collapse did not produce a complete genetic replacement of the affected populations within 2 generations. The fall of Rome did not erase the Romans. The populations contracted, dispersed, transformed, but they persisted genetically. Tartaria's core population apparently did not. This is where the mud flood theory enters the conversation, and I want to handle this carefully, because the mud flood as a popular internet idea is wrapped in a great deal of noise. But strip away the noise, and there is a genuine archaeological question at its center, one that professional archaeology has not fully resolved. Across Siberia, Central Asia, and into Eastern Europe, there are buildings, many of them quite grand, where the ground floor has been buried. Not through deliberate construction below grade, buried. Windows that now open at knee level. Doorways partly submerged in earth. Foundations that, when excavated, reveal full stories beneath what is now the ground surface. The conventional explanation is sedimentation over time, gradual accumulation of soil and debris across centuries. This is geologically plausible in many cases, but the consistency of the depth across regions that experienced different geological conditions and the speed implied by the architectural evidence has led some geologists to ask whether a more rapid depositional event occurred. I'm not asserting that it did. I'm noting that the question has been raised by people with relevant expertise, and that the conventional explanation, slow sedimentation, carries its own assumptions about timeline that have not been rigorously tested against the physical evidence in many of the key locations. The question is legitimate. The answer is unresolved. What a rapid depositional event would have done to a surviving population is not difficult to model. It would have disrupted agriculture instantly. It would have contaminated water sources. It would have buried infrastructure, rendering the tools of civilization inaccessible, and it would have created conditions ideal for epidemic disease to spread through displaced, malnourished populations. Notice that sequence. A depositional event that disrupts food production and contaminates water, that creates displaced populations moving through unfamiliar territory, that weakens immune systems through malnutrition. These are precisely the conditions under which plague spreads most rapidly and most completely. The mechanisms are not separate. They reinforce each other. This is the moment where I want to be most careful. because here is where the argument can slide from observation into assertion, and I don't want to make that slide. What I am describing is a convergence of conditions. I am not claiming those conditions were coordinated. I am asking whether they converged in a way that exceeded chance, because here is the coordination problem. For this collapse to have been purely accidental, you would need plague, climate disruption, military devastation, and geological events to peak simultaneously in the same region, targeting the same population. Each of those things happened independently elsewhere. Together, simultaneous in one place, that is a different question entirely. And the institutions that benefited from the vacuum, the Russian Empire expanding east, the Ottoman state pressing north, the Chinese dynasties consolidating their western borders, did not need to coordinate with each other to benefit from the same outcome. Competing powers can exploit the same collapse without communicating. Interest doesn't require conspiracy to organize itself. This is what I mean when I talk about silence organizing itself. The historical record of Tartaria, cartographic, architectural, genetic, was not suppressed by a single hand. It was absorbed, reframed, and gradually deprioritized by multiple institutions simultaneously, each acting in its own interest, each finding it convenient to look forward rather than back. Russian imperial historiography had every reason to frame its eastern expansion as the civilizing of a void, rather than the conquest of a civilization. Ottoman historiography had its own narrative priorities. Chinese dynastic history had long practiced the careful management of what the periphery was permitted to mean. None of these required a meeting. They required only convergent interest. Now, the giants. I've been circling this deliberately because it is the part that most strains credibility, and therefore demands the most careful treatment. The claim, in its popular form, is that Tartaria's people were physically larger than modern humans, significantly so. I take that claim seriously, only to a limited point. The documented historical range of human stature is wider than most people realize. The Nilotic peoples of East Africa regularly produce individuals above 7 feet. The Dinaric Alps region of the former Yugoslavia held, for decades, the highest average male height ever recorded for a regional population. Unusual stature is not biologically impossible. It is regionally variable. What the genetic dilution hypothesis suggests, in its most scientifically grounded form, is not that Tartaria was populated by mythological giants, but that it held a population with a genetic profile that included height and physical scale at the upper range of human normal, and that what replaced them did not share that profile. If a population with genes for exceptional stature was reduced and replaced by incoming groups with different genetic characteristics, the physical type would cease to be common. Within generations it becomes rare, dismissed as anomaly. Within a century, it survives only in traveller accounts written before the collapse, accounts that subsequent historians then read as exaggeration. Those accounts exist, not as fringe documents, as mainstream historical texts. The descriptions of unusually large-bodied individuals in the chronicles of the Mongol court, the observations of early Russian explorers moving east, the accounts recorded by Chinese imperial emissaries travelling to the western regions, these appear across independent traditions in ways that resist easy dismissal. The mainstream response to these accounts is consistent. Exaggeration, cultural distance, the tendency of chroniclers to amplify the otherness of peoples they encountered. This is methodologically sound, but sound methods can be correct in most cases and still fail in specific ones. The average tendency to exaggerate doesn't erase the possibility of a genuine outlier, and here is the thing about genetic dilution as a mechanism of defeat. It requires no weapons. It requires no battle. It requires only that the original population be reduced below the threshold of demographic recovery through plague, displacement, famine, or any combination, and that a different population moves into the space before recovery can occur. That process doesn't need to be designed, it needs only to be permitted, or at most gently facilitated. Trade routes that carry disease rather than goods, borders that guide displaced populations rather than contain them, administrative frameworks that categorize and assimilate rather than preserve. None of that requires a mastermind. It requires only institutions operating in their own interest. I want to be honest with you about where this leaves me, because intellectual honesty at this point in the argument demands it. I cannot prove that the collapse of Tartaria was anything other than a convergence of natural disasters and historical pressures. The evidence I've described is suggestive of a pattern. It is not proof of intent. What I can say is that the pattern is consistent, consistently too consistent to set aside without examination. The plague begins in the heartland. The infrastructure collapses faster than military campaigns explain. The genetics replace rather than recover. The buildings go underground. And the memory, cartographic, architectural, biological, is compressed into a footnote within 2 centuries. 2 centuries for a civilization that built cities of extraordinary scale, administered a postal network larger than any contemporary system, and produced a human type that observers from 3 independent cultural traditions described in strikingly consistent terms. 2 centuries to go from the center of the known world to a footnote on an old map. I keep coming back to the maps themselves, not because of what they show, but because of when they stop. The cartographic tradition that placed Tartaria as a major geopolitical entity continues robustly through the 17th century and then, across multiple national traditions simultaneously, begins to quietly dissolve the territory into component parts, not replaced by new information, dissolved. The land doesn't change, the people living on it don't disappear from the maps, but the name and the entity and the implication of a coherent civilization with its own identity gradually stops appearing. Different cartographic traditions operating independently arrive at the same editorial decision at roughly the same historical moment. That is the coordination problem in its purest form. Not a conspiracy, a convergence. Multiple institutions in different countries with different political interests, all finding it necessary to retire the same concept from their maps at the same time, without any documented communication about why. The silence organized itself. That is what bothers me. I don't know what Tartaria was. I don't know whether its people were the type the chronicles describe, or whether those descriptions are distortions of cultural distance. I don't know whether the collapse was natural or facilitated, accidental or permitted. I've been honest about those limits throughout, and I'll stay honest now. What I know is that the official explanation, fragmentation, Russian expansion, natural disaster, the general entropy of nomadic confederacies, is not wrong. It's incomplete, and the parts it's incomplete about are the parts that would matter most if the story turns out to be something other than what the textbooks have settled on. The genetic replacement, the buried infrastructure, the simultaneous cartographic erasure, the plague originating at the center rather than the periphery, the architectural scale calibrated across thousands of kilometers for something larger than the populations that came after. Each of those details has an explanation. None of those explanations, taken together, fully accounts for all of them at once, and I keep thinking about what a civilization would look like from the outside, 200 years after it had been defeated, not with weapons, but with conditions, biological, geological, administrative conditions, that simply made it impossible for that civilization to continue being what it was. What would the record look like? It would look exactly like an absence where a presence once stood, like maps that name something and then quietly stop, like buildings still standing but belonging to no one who remembers building them, like a genetic lineage that drops from the record, not because its carriers died in battle, but because they simply ran out of descendants. I don't know if that's what happened, genuinely. But the silence, when you sit with it long enough, stops feeling like the silence of something that never existed. It starts feeling like the silence of something left deliberately without a voice. And those two silences sound different once you know how to listen.